We'll just start the recording in case anybody wants to rewatch. Yeah, there's a lot of little juicy tidbits, I guess, and all of that. One thing I'll say though, that if anybody ever has something that they really want to talk about, but you think it's like a one-on-one, just make it a less personal question. Make it something that, because very likely the human experience is far more similar than it is different. So very likely anything that one person is experiencing, either everyone else has experienced or will experience to some extent. So all topics could be a very good topic for discussion. If it feels too personal and you don't want the group study to resemble a one-on-one, just make it general.
I don't have any, I think everyone has determined that I have absolutely no privacy issues about personal things. It's either because it involves other people or because it feels too specific to me that I don't want to take away from the
Sure.
group, whatever. But I'm sure there's a universal
Mhm.
essence to every personal experience that can be approached that way. I see what you're saying.
Mhm.
Um, I do have one, and it was something I thought of when I opened my eyes. So I guess it's worth bringing up. I was speaking to my cousin on the phone, and we hadn't spoken in a while, so we were talking about, I don't know, whatever was going on in each other's lives, her children, my brothers, whatever, life in different state, and our physical condition, the things you talk about. And we talk about spirit and dead people because we have that whole conversation, which I've never brought up in class, but that's a whole nother thing. So she said to me, "You seem less patient since you moved. Um, it seems like you're less patient." I don't remember the exact words that she said. And I thought, huh, is that how it looks? I didn't feel offended or defensive, because I know from my experience that I have far more patience. I'm so accepting of letting things unfold that it probably appears that I don't care as much about. Like I am less likely to choose deliberate folly than I used to get far more into other people's rabbit holes for compassionate reasons, for altruistic reasons. And I now recognize that it has nothing to do with um, my care or concern or appreciation of them or love of them or interest. I don't want to even say interest because I'm not very interested. It's not my business. A lot of what they're, I have no desire to for drama, for the nonsensical words of drama. It's not fun for me. I if there's a connection with someone and we can find a connected space to talk about things, that's deliberate folly to me. And I'll entertain that with them and enjoy that with them. But I'm not interested in the overall volume of that in my life anymore. Um, so I think that she was observing a change in me that she looked at as I don't have patience for things, for people and things like I used to. And I used to, make my life about other people's helping other people with their stuff. I mean, way too, way in an extreme. That was,
So she's missing you getting into the nitty gritty, Donna.
yeah,
She's missing you getting into all the finer details and analysing every bit of her conversation or her life or giving her advice on every situation that she brings to you. So she's feeling the loss of that, possibly,
yeah.
and
Um,
feeling that you're not as patient because you're not interested in all the details anymore, the tiny details. Not that you're not interested in her, we know that, but she might feel that you're not as involved
yeah,
in it all as what you used to be.
even,
That's just my observation.
yeah, and there's less overlap with, how we spend our time and what we want to talk about. We can still connect, but the bullshit has no value to me whatsoever. I'm not even good at being tolerant of it. I can still be there. I mean, like if I'm in a family gathering or whatever, I can still be interacting and not get like, "Ah, I just want to get out of here." I know how to entertain my own mind. I can be there and be engaging my own senses at the same time. But, we just talk on the phone because it's the only way we can visit often. And I'm just relaying to other situations and like, no, I said no. And I did say to her, I'm making a concerted effort to say yes to more things because I recognize that I'm becoming isolated and I'm fine with it. But there's a whole world out there and I can say yes to some things and and it not be tormenting. I'm going to the Walnut Beach business association social. Everyone wants me to be in their group, and I'm not really very interested in any of their groups, but I'm going to go to the social. So I'm trying to say yes to things just for experimental purposes. Because if I limit my experience, then I limit my choices. I limit what's available from which to choose. So, um, and there's a part of me that misses that. And who knows what I'll discern from and acquire from those experiences. So that's the way I'm looking at it. But I don't feel like I'm missing anything.
See, I have that too, where, people say to me, you need to get out more. And do I really? I mean, I can find a million things to, well, you can, uh, I
To enjoy,
find,
to appreciate,
yeah,
to yeah.
I want to be at home so much. It's my place where it's not, it's not like I'm addicted to staying here, but I find it interesting, especially at this time of the year when the garden's all, I can look at the same plant 100 times a day to see if it's behaving differently to the sun or whatever is happening around me. And I almost resent days when I'm called away to do
Yeah.
other things. That's why swimming in the sea is good because I can do that quickly in the morning. Maybe we're extending our swim till possibly half an hour today because the weather's beautiful and the water's warm. But ordinarily, I can dip down there, go for a swim, come back, go for a walk, do that all, and have the whole afternoon to myself before dinner time to explore life in my garden and in my studio. And I don't see anything wrong with that, except other people do kind of point out that you're becoming isolated or, I mean, people talked about the lockdown. I loved the lockdown. I loved it. I thought it put everybody on the same level. And I was very, very happy and content in my bubble. Not, the fact that it was a rule that you didn't have to go out. There was less shopping, less all of that. There was a few things that I missed, but not many. Suited me ideally. So I know where you're coming from, Donna, and I do make that effort to when my friends ask me, because my friends are important, and I don't want to become friendless and a non-communicator and an oddball or a crater, what we would call an odd crater, one of those oddballs, you know. Um,
I think it's
and
too late for me. I think I'm already one of those, but yeah, I know what you mean.
I do. I think I'm one of those too. But I notice people looking at me strangely when I say certain things or use certain vocabulary. I get that like little laugh, like, "Oh my God, you said whatever." But yeah, it's the life that we live in, and I just want to totally embrace it. All of the isness that is around me and in my environment. Because what else can you do? I mean, I am not in a position to jump on a plane and fly halfway around the world. Now, I would do that. I would do that if the occasion arises. I've traveled a bit in the past. I would do it again, but it's not suitable at the minute. So why not make the most of what you've got? That's what we're here to learn, to expand into your own environment. And I mean, I found a little walkway, and I've been here 3 years. It was a little path off the beach that took you under a bridge and into this lovely place that I didn't even know existed. And it's like a little, it's small, but you know, it's like a wee forest with trails through it. You know, and if you don't go out and explore these things, how do you know what's around you in your own environment without having to hop on a plane and go somewhere?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there if you guys want, but you know, I think almost want to send Jerry a message, because this is the type of discussion that sometimes gets a little bit veered. But there's a lot of ways to look at this, and of course, the way that I look at things is in principle. So it's the principle of the matter, and the principles will manifest themselves on an individual experience, on an individual level. The principles are principles. There'll be principles of nature. There'll be principles of, I mean, very likely you'll be able to create a mathematical geometrical formula if you wanted to of the principles, you know, to represent it in, you know, a variety of different ways. But if you look at the 5 destroyer, or if you, yeah, specifically the 5th destroyer is the collective momentum of society. And that is actually, that spans and crosses the boundary of what we would view as like cultural separations, separation by space and time. That separation doesn't exist with the 5th destroyer. You can see similarities in pretty much every culture to a certain extent. So the principle is very clear that the more a person, you can just look at this. How many people are practicing an Qigong type of practice and are doing anything remotely near what we're doing on average? Yeah, there's probably people doing this, and I'm not, you know, being fatalistic and saying nobody else in the world is doing what we're doing. But I'm in a city of 3 million people, and the axis of hydrostasy is happening in one mind only, very likely, and that's mine. And that's okay. However, in principle, that is a different dynamic, a different direction. The energy is different. The thought is different. Therefore, the action will be different. The behavior will be different. The words will be different, very likely, than what is going on in general, because you're just not doing it. You know, I could go on and on. I mean, I could literally just talk for the next 2 hours about how this shows up, you know, and you guys, you both just gave excellent examples of how it shows up. It will show up for every single person who does this practice, and I don't want to say advanced, but it has to start to be accumulated to the point that it is leading to behavioral changes. It's the behavior, because of the way that we're thinking is different, the overall amount of thinking is different. That puts you in a small percentile if you wanted to look at it in terms of statistics. The percentage of people who are clearing their mind, creating gaps in the overall volume of thought, is low. Low. I don't, of course, I don't have an exact statistic. How could I? But I can assure you that it is quite low. So low, in fact, that people won't really know how to process it. They won't know what to do with it. And what they will do with it will always be a reflection of them. It will be a reflection of their own mind, because they're making opinionated thoughts, concepts around what you are doing or what you should be doing. And what you should be doing will be directly proportional to the societal factors, whether local or the 5th destroyer. The 5th destroyer is not local, but there are still local societal factors. You know, maybe in one place It's very common to go out drinking every single weekend, and that's what everybody does. But the second you don't do that, and even though Ina and Donna, of course, aren't speaking against what other people are doing, it is energetically opposed. It is diametrically opposed in terms of differentiation. It's so some people, I've heard this all when I was growing up. Everybody wants to be different. I'm different. I'm different. The best gauge of difference is what we're talking about here, because it's truly, and I guess different is a word that we could use, but it is fundamentally a different wavelength. So if you imagine the four destroyers like a beam of energy, and it has power and it has solidity because it has momentum, it has volume behind it, it has the minds of 7 billion people and has had the minds of these people for thousands of years to accumulate this momentum. And this practice will take you out of that beam of light. And then before you know it, you're just this little photon that's kind of floating around that powerful beam of light, and you're aware of it, because if you're not aware of it, you easily get sucked back into it. You'll be right back in it. So I think a good section of warrior training, specifically warrior training, because that's when the behavior changes really start to manifest themselves. You really start to see how behavior is changing. I think there could be a good section called being unapologetically yourself. When we really talk about the authenticity, our own authenticity, sometimes that will not jive with the way that the masses or local groups, I'm sure Ida, where you live, there's as much of a local community as there is a larger community. Sometimes in the US that's lacking, not always. In America you can have these local bubbles of social influences, and then you have the larger bubble of social influence. This practice will absolutely create that little photon that's outside of that beam of light. So the fifth destroyer, you can look at it as like this very powerful wavelength. I mean, it is very, very powerful. It has thousands of years of collective momentum going through it, and it is just this stream of human momentum. And usually when people say I'm different, or we're difference and differentiation, it's just the thought. The thoughts that they're thinking may be slightly less common than the thoughts that other people are thinking, and that's fine. That has a place. Everything is fine. It's all within a particular context, I suppose. But this practice will fundamentally put you right out here. It will, because this momentum is also directional. Like, this is a stream, a powerful river, a flooding rapid of human momentum. And this practice will fundamentally put you out on these edges. It has to, because the fifth destroyer eventually is something that you become privy to. You can see it. This isn't a judgment. This is an opinion. It is a principle. And when you take that's why I call it seeing, perspective. The altered aperture of one's perception changes. So, I mean, I could give literally 100 examples right now about how my actions, not my thoughts, not the shit that's going on in my mind, but my behavior is fundamentally different than what is most commonly represented in both the microcosm and macrocosm of the social networks, the social soup that we're all swimming in, unless you're just on Zoom here, but you're living in the Amazon rainforest all by yourself. But even then, there'll be a social soup with the animals once they start to figure out you're there and stuff like that. So you'll have a whole, that won't be a part of the fifth destroyer though, because they're not a part of the human collective momentum, because they're not human. So that's pretty obvious. But so I think the reason that this is also important to discuss a little bit later is because you should also have the tools to navigate this if you're doing your practice. So none of this should be 1, surprising, 2, a problem, but 3, you will notice it. You will feel it. It will come up. People will say shit. You know, there's all kinds of things that people will say because they are formulating opinions about what you're doing without the details and knowledge of what you're doing. Does that make sense? That's a very basic principle. It's a very basic dynamic. You have done it. I have done it. People are doing it right now. People will be doing it probably for the rest of our lives and onward. That's why a lot of times people say that your opinion is just a reflection of your own mind, especially when they have no data point, they have no information, no data, no experiential understanding, no real knowledge of what you're doing. What else can they do besides conjecture? And their opinions will be going through a lens of perception that is very different than your lens of perception. And I would say that that is one of the most fundamental things that happens later in the practice, is that as we continue to practice, that lens of perception fundamentally shifts. This is what we're doing is not surface. It can start that way, you know, with basic alignment, and then maybe a person is good with that and they never move on in the practice. But what we're doing is we're fundamentally altering the lens of perception. And that will fundamentally alter your behavior, the way you look at things, the way you collaborate with other people. Very likely you'll stop gossiping. Very likely you'll stop participating in certain conversations that don't feel inspiring because it's repetitive, it's habitual, it's not making you feel well. Think about the warrior training violations of thought or the traps of thinking. How many conversations fundamentally include those violations of principle? So how many times would a conversation, if you participated in it, be a violation of the Qigong principle? A lot, right? But there is a certain point, I would assume.
Most of them,
Mhm.
most of them were violations of it.
Yeah.
And then I found that that's the first place where my practice would weaken and drop, because I'd have to put aside my practice to have this conversation. And now I don't, at first, what I chose to do is not have the conversation at all because I didn't want to be pulled away from my practice, until I realized that I can do both. And so there's this duality of things that more and more dualities seems to exist, is that I feel an incredible amount of freedom in the fact that I don't have any vested interest or concern about other people's opinion of me, including my own cousins. Um, um, However, I feel more for her and connected to her than I ever have.
That makes sense.
And it's okay that if, you know, and I uh, enjoy, I'm going to visit her. I'm going to Long Island this weekend, and she will be, she's not very mobile, so she will be included in my itinerary while I'm home, and I will enjoy the time that I spend with her because I've already decided to do that. And no matter what happens. And but I also could not see her because of our life circumstances, and that's okay too. Doesn't change how I feel about it. It doesn't change my connection with her. It doesn't change how I move forward in the world. It doesn't change anything, because the only place that happens is here. So
Right.
yeah, so it's that duality. I find more and more duality, that I can be intimately more connected with someone and care less about how they see me or view me or even appreciate me. It's a funny thing.
And then, so I think it's really important to note that one of the things that we'll notice the most eventually, I would assume that everybody that's practicing this to a certain degree will notice these things, but freedom is a fickle word in our society. In the world in general, the word freedom is a very relative, finite concept. Usually the word freedom means you're allowed to do something, but how can that be freedom? So if Donna says, Ernest, you can go outside, you're free. Well, wait a second, you just gave me permission. You could take that permission away. Like, what are we really talking about? How is that freedom? So
It's about the space.
yeah, yeah. And so the way that I define the word freedom is the freedom to have or not have and still feel free. Does that make sense before I go on and apply that to the?
It makes sense. I don't think of it that way. I think about the feeling of freedom for me, the actual word, what it means to me is the amount of space that's available for me to engage.
Sure, yeah,
And so I can have, that space exists and I can have access to it and do have access to it, depending on where I place my awareness. So it doesn't matter whatever else is happening. It's the freedom is that I am existing, I am choosing to exist above the threshold of recognition of the space that's available to me to engage.
yeah. I think that's more, and I like that. I think that's more technique. And I think that's more how it's happening, is we're creating space in the overall volume of thought, which allows the feeling of freedom to exist. Kind of what I'm talking about in relative to what you guys were talking about is more on a social level, on the level of, you can look at this and see this in the world. Is a person truly free if they feel bound by a desire, or they feel that they must, or they have to? Do you see what I mean? So
But
Santina,
deliberate choice.
yes.
Sorry, Ernest. I know you want to answer Santina's question. Deliberate choice comes into that freedom as well, because if you choose to act a certain way, or actually your behavior, if you choose to do a certain thing, well, then that's where the freedom, I think, comes into your mind or into your heart, because you've chosen it, and then you can accept that choice. And that's where the freedom is, and the freedom in the choosing of all the options that you've got. The freedom is in the choosing of that one particular option that you choose. Am I
Right,
going off on a
but
tangent?
you have to
Maybe
be
I'm doing-
aware of that space. You have to be existing above
Yes,
the threshold of
yeah.
recognition. Like you said, you can find so many things in your little space, the same view that you looked at a million times. You appreciate you populate so much data in that view that you can see it differently every time. As the sun changes during the course of the day, as the wind picks up, it's a different view because you're choosing, and you can't choose unless you're existing above the threshold of recognition. So all those options are available to you. There's plenty to populate from your window.
Right.
So if you're unconscious, you can feel like there's no choice because you're just in the pattern, in the habit.
And then
When you're in the
there is
pattern
no
and in the
choice.
habit, you're
Yeah.
trapped. You
Yeah.
feel trapped.
Right.
But whenever you can consciously choose, deliberately choose, that's, I think, where the freedom comes in.
Yeah. And let me explain. So I can tie all of this together with Santina's question as well.
Of course
So
you can.
it's a
That's
talent.
why we're here.
It's a thing. So Santina, so first we started talking about the more a person practices the Qigong practice, specifically when their behavior starts to change, there can be a lot of judgment from others. That is a statistical anomaly that many people who practice Qigong will experience. Excuse me, a statistical consistency that people who practice Qigong will very likely experience, because the way that we're thinking, or are we even thinking at all, will be diametrically opposed to the world around us. And I don't want to use the word oppose, it will be differentiation. Opposed is kind of a different word when there's a feeling of tensity. If a person's really doing their practice and we're really engaging, there will be no tensity. There's just adaptation, which I call deliberate folly. That's why I say everything is deliberate folly. It's not a tool I use to talk to people about the weather. it's everything in my life experience, because death is my advisor. And death, when it's about to touch me, will say, is this really that important? And quite frankly, none of it is. Absolutely none of it is.
So, I'm sorry, I just want to
To a certain-
clarify that. So
Yeah.
are you saying that every choice, like Ida just said, the choices that you make, that's where the freedom is. So you're saying that every choice that you make is a direction or a redirection,
Mhm.
and every one of those is deliberate folly because you're choosing it from the
Yes.
infinite amount of choices. You are plucking something from the
Yes.
infinite and making that your experience, and that is
Yes.
deliberate folly.
And
And that's why
all of it.
everything is deliberate
Absolutely.
folly.
Absolutely. And
Ah.
also the word folly, because human beings have a
That's going on a quote card. That's going
Excellent.
on a quote card.
That's a good one.
Everything is deliberate folly.
Everything is deliberate folly. Yeah. So I think that could have been some of the misunderstanding with deliberate folly, is it looks like a technique to, listen to the old man talk about the weather when we're really not interested. No, it is, the word folly is also to help reduce the seriousness that the mind can get very fatalistic. It can start to take things way too seriously. And then before you know it, it's like, oh, I'm just so, and then it's like, whoa, what do we really spilt our tea now? Because death will advise me that you're making all of your markings in the sand. Absolutely every single thing that you do will have an echo, but it will be washed by the tide. Does that make sense? This too shall pass.
So even my experience in the ER,
Even your,
everything I chose to appreciate was my deliberate
it was
folly.
your
Well,
deliberate
that
folly.
takes it to a whole nother
Of
understanding
course.
for
Yeah.
me.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm glad that
Yeah. No, it's going on a quote card for a long time.
And so, Santina, I will tell you the most unique feature of the Qigong practice and how that relates to space, how that space relates to deliberate folly, how that space relates to freedom, how that space relates to choice. Because most people, I was included, if you are in a pattern, and if you're not being above the threshold, if your mind is not above the active threshold of recognition, you are in a pattern. You are acting out something that is fundamentally based on memory. It's an automatic type of thing that we're involved in. Does that make sense? So it's all just decision. So should I go left or should I go right? That's a decision. That we're really not plucking out the infinity of choice there, because it's just, do I make pancakes for breakfast or do I make biscuits? Those are decisions. Those are great. We make decisions every single day. Decisions are cool. And I'm not declaring war on decisions. I make decisions all the time. Am I going to pet my dog in a circular clockwise rotation or a counterclockwise rotation? That's a decision. I'm not plucking out from the infinite possibility of choice. And I'm making this distinction for a reason. Like, we could get into the semantics and start, dividing it up, and I encourage you to do that to a certain extent if it feels natural to you. But so the space is what it's all about. The space, when we get to if and when a person gets to the end of the hydrostatic practice, hydrostasy, the highest technique in this practice, and the highest. I don't want to put things on a level, but it is the technique of techniques, is to engage the space you have created. Because when you engage the space that you have created, that space grows. What do we mean by space? The biggest differentiation between this practice and pretty much everything else under the sun, this practice creates space in the overall volume of thought. So if you're doing Qigong practice and you're thinking from the time that you wake up, from the time that you go to bed, very likely you're not doing your Qigong practice. Very likely you're forgetting much more than you're remembering, or we're coasting, or our points of intention are not deliberately intended in advance, and it's kind of wishy-washy. And that may be good for the afternoon, good for the evening, good for the week, but there will come some time and it will displace the individual if they're not firmly rooted in their practice. This practice will create gaps in the overall volume of thought. What do you think is accessible now that we have created gaps in the overall volume of thought? I'll give you a hint. Everything. absolutely everything is now accessible because we have created the space necessary to create without the interference of our own cognition, of our own habits, of our own patterns, of our own mind. So the more that we create space, as Ida pointed out, the more we start to pluck from infinity what we want to do with our lives, what we want to do with our afternoon, what we want to do with our own cognition, what we want to do with our mind. That's choice, because we're plucking. You cannot access infinity when you are stuck in a pattern. That doesn't even make sense. It's not logical to say that a person who is below the threshold of active recognition is actually even really making any authentic choices at all, because they're not accessing authenticity, because there's no space created. What do I mean by that? I mean that the thoughts are repetitive, the actions are repetitive, the human being in general, if they're below the threshold of active recognition, is cyclical, habitual, acting on memory, mostly just a product of recall. Does that make sense? But in this practice, especially in warrior training, because we will, if you're not doing warrior training, I don't know how you're going to access this. It's just that simple. I don't know. Maybe you do. Who knows? Like I'm not all knowing. Like I don't know what the hell you're doing with your mind. You'd have to tell me, or I'd have to follow you around for a little while and see how little things are triggering you. And then I'd be like, well, that's okay. No judgment, but we might want to back our practice up a little bit. But the warrior training practice has what we call the traps of thinking. The traps of thinking are comparing, contrasting, trying to figure it out, compartmentalizing, labeling, judging, all of these things. And then eventually we have the big two. What are the big two? What are the big two aspects of thought that must be redirected towards the end of your warrior training practice?
Self and others.
Self and others. Anytime you are thinking, that doesn't mean you don't care about yourself, because you're doing, by that time, you're probably doing a ton of self-care. Like Ida's mentioning, you're opening up the mind so that you can actually access spirit, access infinity. Even in the spirit, the anatomy of the spirit, it is still fundamentally required for you to quiet your mind in order to be able to sense into the moment and perceive everything that she's talking about. In Don Juan, that was the same. In almost every culture that I have ever read, that is a prerequisite. You must create the space to access the infinite. It's a dynamic, it's a principle. I can't make this shit up. You have felt it. I can give examples all over the globe, all over life, all over society, where this is a fundamental principle of the universe. It's a fact. It is the way it is. If you have mental interference, it's interference. It's interfering with what we call the lens of perception. And your perception is distorted, it's clouded, it's being interfered with. It's not as reflective of what you're actually experiencing, because it's going through all of the cognitive mumbo jumbo. So what Ida's talking about is,
if you watch a movie and there's a shaman or like a Native American chief, you always notice to go out into the desert or somewhere and do some kind of ritual. And that obviously is a mind clearing, not obviously, but you would think it would be a mind clearing before they can work on somebody else.
Right.
They need to create that space or that feeling of infinity within themselves so that they can help out the person they're going to help.
Absolutely. And the reason, Ida, that they would do the ceremonies and the rituals is typically they will be highly they'll usually be difficult to an onlooker. Like they'd be like, oh my God, but it's usually highly intricate. What do we know about intricate activities? They require focus. They require attention. It must be pristine. You can't do this ceremony while thinking dumb shit. You won't be able to do it. That's why if you do read Don Juan, when Don Juan would give Carlos a myriad of tasks to do, he even said, it's not the tasks themselves that are creating the power, it's the intricacy that requires your focus. And it's the focus of your attention is where that power comes from. So
wax on, wax off.
Exactly. Yeah. It's not so much in the technique itself. The technique does not work by the technique alone, but the amount of momentum behind the technique and the degree of focus. So the more that we do our Qigong practice, especially when it starts to get into more momentum and we start to transition through the different phases, our mind will have legitimate space. We won't be thinking all the time. We won't be thinking repetitive. We won't be thinking habitual. We won't be labeling, judging, comparing, contrasting, labeling, thinking about ourselves all the time, thinking about other people. Again, that doesn't mean you don't care about people. Those two are completely different things. You thinking about somebody actually has nothing to do with you caring about them. It's just a habitual pattern of cognition that a person engages when they're below the threshold of active recognition. We wouldn't choose. I'm not going to choose to sit here and think about Karen and think about all her problems, I'm putting that in air quotes, and how to fix them and what she should do and I'm not going to do that. That makes no sense. So, Santina, the space that we're talking about is the space in the overall volume of thought. Average cognition out of 7 billion people, 6.99999 billion people are thinking from the time that they wake up, from the time that they go to bed. People who are spiritual, people who meditate, people who think they're doing whatever they think they're doing are thinking about what they're doing and thinking about what other people are. And there are exceptions. Thich Nhat Hanh was an excellent exception, I think. I look up to Thich Nhat Hanh as an example of one of those exceptions, that there very likely was an incredible amount of space in the overall volume of thought. That doesn't mean the mind's not active. Thich Nhat Hanh's mind was incredibly active with connection with the world around, the feeling of proprioception and the feeling, maybe not in his words, but the feeling of spirit, the feeling of accessing infinity. It feels like something. We can feel that. And it's not just thinking about.
And the instrument that is his body, through which he is experiencing all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We have about 80 to 100 trillion cells, bacterial and human. Every single one of those are sustaining your consciousness right now. They're all working together so that you have consciousness and can project attention and intention ultimately. Qigong is fundamentally a practice of intention that if you really push the envelope, you will be able to interact with energy directly. That is impossible with interference. I'll say that again. And I'm not going to debate this because it's a principle that I see as clear as I see everybody in front of me right now. It is impossible with interference to do a wide variety of things with the mind and in the human experience. So what most people do in the world today is they go from one type of thinking to another type of thinking, thinking that the new thinking is somehow better thinking. And it might be to a certain extent. If you've been going around thinking about how much you hate people, now you're going around thinking about how much you love people. I mean, eventually that could lead to cognitive dissonance and toxic positivity, but it could be beneficial. I'm not there to judge another person's practice and what they're doing. However, it is not creating gaps in the overall volume of thought. So the Qigong practitioner, especially in warrior training, is taking the 90 percentile of thought to 80, to 70, to 60, to 50, to 40, to 30. In hydrostasy, we're at 30, 20. And the thoughts that do come out of the mind membrane, as I'm calling it, the thoughts that do come out of the mind membrane are typically creative, new, refreshing, exciting. There's a fundamental thing to it because it just went through infinity. It just went through the infinite possibility that we can access when there's not interference. Does all of this make sense? And then in alignment to what we were talking about earlier, that's different. That's fundamentally different than the vast majority of people that are around you. Is that something you need to think about? No. Thinking about that would be a violation of principle. It's not necessary. I don't need to walk around thinking that nobody else is doing what Ernest is doing. I don't need to think that. It's empirically true. Like I know that it's true, but I don't need to think about it. I don't need to care about it. It's a non-factor. It's just an observational thing at best. Santina says it is then With much attention, you have no room in your mind for thought. I call this in the Yi Gong book, which hopefully I can give you by the end of the day today, most likely tomorrow, is the mindfulness slider. So you can think of human attention. Attention is the mind's ability to isolate aspects of its environment. So that's a very basic definition of attention. The mindfulness slider is we only can give our attention so much, right? We really can't. Start to call it multitasking, but modern psychology shows that the average person, most people aren't actually multitasking. They're rapidly shifting back and forth between tasks. There's not multiple things actually going on in the cognitive space. So Santina, the mindfulness slider, and you are correct. What you just said is absolutely correct. So the more, let's say this is thought, and this is more spatial attention. For example, it could be body attention, it could be a wide variety of different techniques of attention, but the mindfulness slider principle fundamentally is that the more you're doing this, the less you can be doing this, because it's a slider. And in fact, I should probably draw the slider with endpoints, because it's not necessarily an infinite line, it's more of a finite line, because we only have so much attention in the moment. Your brain uses ATP, and you only have so much ATP in your brain. We can start to get down to the cellular level as much as we can get into the psychological, and I'm putting this in air quotes because it's not a word I typically use, spiritual level. So Santina, our practice exists in the spatial attention, the deliberate attention, the attention away from just thoughts on everything else. I don't say the present moment because it's the moment happening now. It's always happening now. It's always moving. It's always shifting. Everything is in a constant transient state of movement and fluctuation. And as much as human beings want to try to violate that principle, it's a principle that cannot be violated whether they think they are or not. So the more we do one thing, the more it goes away from the other. So to answer your question, or, because you did state it, but in a question form, the more our attention is above the threshold of active recognition, meaning that you put it there on purpose, the best way to do that, and I stand by this as a cornerstone of the Yi Gong practice, is to deliberately intend your point of attention in advance. If you don't, you're going to be infinitely more susceptible to coasting. The only time that I will recommend points being freestyle is when you have created space in the overall volume of cognition, and that has gained a little bit of momentum, because then you're very likely in a state of flow, whether it's macro or micro. You are very likely in synchronization with the universe and the world around you and how everything else is moving, and you're supremely adaptable in that case. I would expect a person to have created a lot of space in order for that sort of phenomenon to occur naturally and on its own. Otherwise, people are very likely just hustling themselves.
But you don't mean as soon as you open your eyes in the morning. As soon as you open your eyes in the morning, you have to choose, right?
What do you mean?
You just said unless the person has achieved a level of, I'm thinking that I'm taking my walk. I woke up this morning, I have my points of attention, I am practicing, I'm taking my walk. My walk is a meditative practice. And so I can get deeper into that practice, and there's more space for that practice because I've been intending it since I opened my eyes, and I especially find it accessible on my beach walk, or the swim in the ocean, or whatever it is for anybody else. And that's when I can free flow my points of attention more. I can because my awareness is well established. But not, I can't wing it the second I open my eyes, because I guess I still have residual habit and momentum that will pick up, or at least I'll be coasting when I open my eyes, and I'm not interested in doing that.
Yes. So remember that the more that we get into the hydrostatic practice, this practice really doesn't involve a lot of thought. I don't talk about thought that much in hydrostasy, because if you're practicing hydrostasy, you're maintaining at least one point of attention all day long. Once you have done that, everything really starts to become about the feeling, because there's less interference. And so when there's less interference, you can pay attention to more than you could before when there was all the interference. Hypothetically, experientially, isn't theoretical evidence. I would say empirically, I view this as principle, as true. Hypothetically, I need more of you all to get through the practice and get more momentum in the practice. But hypothetically, you can wake up and instantly go into certain feelings that do not necessarily require intending it in advance. Does that make sense? Hypothetically, I don't want to talk about that too much because that will be more of a accumulated momentum aspect of hydrostasy.
Right, because there's a seamlessness. Right now, it's just a porosity. It's
Yeah.
more porous for me
Sure.
between sleep and wakefulness.
Yes.
It's more porous a place, and there's more fluidity between it. So it's not a separate, okay, I open my eyes and now I'm starting. As long as I'm breathing, I'm practicing, I have some level of awareness. So I'm not as practiced in hydrostasy enough to not see any, it's not seamless. There are seams.
And that's okay. It's just a part of the practice. So yeah, and I know that's okay for Donna because she's at the point in her practice that she wouldn't let the seams turn into psychological. They're just seams, and eventually it will be more seamless.
No,
And
it's
you
just
always,
something to work with. It's something to help me discern. It's something to
Exactly.
move toward and through. That's
Yes,
all.
that's all. Yep. So Santina, to answer your question, yes. I'll just say yes. Yes, the more that you are paying attention deliberately above the threshold of active recognition, in Qigong, those points of attention are determined in advance so that you're not hustling yourself, so that you can make sure that you're actually doing your practice and you're not just hovering. Some people are coasting and some people are just kind of hovering at that line of the active threshold of recognition. That can actually start to look a little bit like zenned out, spaced out, kind of there, kind of not there. And again, that's okay. That's a nice little place to be, I suppose, at times or whatever. I'm not, that could also be a part of the seams as a person is doing their practice. But I will almost guarantee you that a person who is not intending their points of attention in advance, if I follow them around long enough, I will see behaviorally certain things aren't expressing themselves the way that they normally would if there was actual space in the overall volume of cognition and thought. So yes, the more that you're doing your practice, the more that you're paying attention on purpose, the less your mind has the ATP, energy, thought capacity to think all of the former thoughts that one would be thinking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it makes sense that you can't hover for long. Hover is just a point in progression because you're either moving, everything is changing. And so either you're evolving you're going with that change, or you are falling into decay because you're not. I mean, you really, sometimes it's baby steps that are barely perceptible, but at least you're even redirection is still pointing toward going with, and that's a process of going with if that's where you are. And certainly I'm there sometimes. I feel myself getting pointed in the wrong direction, and decay is so stagnation is decay to me is so unappealing that it's easier and easier to choose redirection and get back to the practice because it's
Yeah.
preferred. Yeah. So I don't think you can hover at that place. Hovering, I don't know. I don't know if you could
It's not
exist
deliberate.
for long.
Yeah, it's starting to lose its deliberate nature. That's actually what people are trying to do when they're just hoping to use the residual momentum of something, the retreat effect. The retreat effect could look a lot like hovering, like you're feeling
it's
in charge.
No, and it's also like I use my practice when I'm going into the meeting, or I use the practice when I'm going to go see my in-laws, or I'm using the practice just to get through some difficult circumstance, but it's not something that you're doing all day embodying.
Exactly. And embodiment is required to access some of the things that I'm talking about in the human experience. Why? Not because Ernest said so. Observe the interference factor. What is interfering with that flow and that connection? And then
And that's all principle based. It's not about levels and better or worse, or it's
No.
just the way energy works.
Yeah, I found myself waking up and the first thoughts that would, and I told my teacher about this. I'm like, I'm pretty sure you're not waking up and thinking about me. So I'm like, why the hell am I waking up and thinking about, the sternoclavicular joint, and why am I wake? And there's a reason why. I know why. I know the dynamics. I don't need to declare war on it. I'm stuffing a lot of information in my mind. You know what? Today, let's talk about the mind membrane. Is that okay? Does that sound like, and I can show you how the brain works with thoughts. Where do thoughts come from? I can show you. It's not rocket science. We've known this. Humans have known this since the dawn of time. It's just not something we pay attention to because we're too busy and engulfed in the habits to really step outside of it and observe it. The one thing I would say to Santina's question, spaced out or hovering is wasting time. I don't look at it that way because time is a concept that we have created. It is the observation of causality, cause and effect. If we didn't have memory and we didn't have an imagination, we would never be able to create the concept that we call time. So nothing is ever a waste of time necessarily. It's always an opportunity to learn, always an opportunity to grow, always an opportunity to observe yourself and see how are things working. How is hovering really working out for you? Or do you just end up in some mind bullshit? And is hovering really leading to this authenticity that we so desperately want as human beings? Is it leading to the space and the freedom to be unapologetically yourself? Ida and Donna were giving examples of their authenticity. Intelligence and desire are starting to align in their experience. Ida really likes being at home. She doesn't want to rush all the time. She really enjoys finding the details of the small area of life that she's in the world. That is her accessing her authenticity. Donna, on the other hand, she could have spent all of her, and this isn't the case, she could have spent all of her time in a small little bubble of the world, and now she wants to branch out and experience. That is her authenticity, and Ida shouldn't judge it. Donna shouldn't judge Ida. Donna really doesn't need to, I shouldn't say shouldn't, doesn't need to. Donna doesn't need to judge herself. She doesn't need to judge another person, because as long as she's creating space in the overall amount of volume of thought and engaging her practice to the nth degree, she will be aligning herself to her own authenticity. And at times, that will put you at odds with the world. And I don't, I don't want to put it at odds because that almost sounds like bunting heads. It will create a differentiation in the stream of everything around you. There is a force. This force can actually be observed scientifically, and you can look at it in terms of mob mentality. It is a force of energy around the group of people, and you can get caught up in that river. Most people don't know that they're in that river when they're in that river because they have no context. You have to actually step out of it. Most people don't know that they have a film over their cognition that's being caused by sugar until you reduce sugar and have that film removed. And then all of a sudden,
Right, so you can't notice that the sugar was an interference until you remove it. It's the hovering is an interference, and when you notice that as an interference, then you can work with that knowledge.
Yes.
Me judging Ida or Ida judging me in the example that you just gave is interference
It is.
in what we're trying to achieve. So the deliberate folly we choose to experience our lives doesn't make one better or worse than the other. So the judgment of it is only interference.
Mm-hmm. There are so many times where I could put myself in a position where I can just like zen out. I feel so good, life is great, but I know all too well that the island of the practical will introduce something that will throw me off my practice if I didn't have points of attention, even if it's not intended in advance, even though it still kind of looks intended in advance, because I tend to go to the same, that connection, that feeling of luminosity, that feeling ... So it still does start to look intended in advance, although I discovered it. It wasn't something that I wrote down on a note card years ago. because it's an undiscovered country. You know, it's an undiscovered island in the sea of possibility that you've just discovered this feeling. And that's why I get into abstract principles rather than telling everybody we should be creating the same feelings, the same associations, because that's erroneous. That's what people have been doing since the dawn of time. When you look at nutrition in America, they create My Plate, and that's supposed to be for every single human being in the United. That's erroneous. It's all erroneous. It's all just a way of generalizing things for the masses. And maybe it has a place. I'm not going to declare war on it because I don't need to, but it's not individualized. It's not, you know, it's not unique to the individual, and everything is unique to our perception is unique to the individual. So the main thing I would say about spaced out or hovering, even if you're feeling good, you know, I just did all of this Qigong practice and here I am in my yard in the sunshine, everything is working out for me. We have lost intention and will. Qigong is fundamentally about intention. If you raise your hand, you didn't think about it. The motor neurons fired, calcium was delivered, all of those things occurred through pure intention. Everything in our life can actually be just like raising our hand. We look at it as just do energy. We look at it as getting shit done. We look at it as action without interference of what? Cognitive interference. Is this making sense? So if
Yes, recognizing interference is different than indulging
indulging in
interference.
absolutely, yeah. Sometimes indulging is something that I would associate with hustling yourself because or cherry picking, because it's usually you recognize it and then still choose to go away from your own practice. And fundamentally, if you're hovering, if you're spaced out, zenned out, then very likely there's no intention to build the will, our mana bar, our personal power. That's the equation. Intention and will builds personal power. I want to do something, I actually do something, that builds personal power. If we can want to do something and actually do something with the least amount of resistance, before you know it, we're just creating. Like we're just constantly creating whatever we want. And if you look at my life experience, you can see that. I don't want to point it out because it can start to sound a bit audacious. But if you look at my experience, you can see that this dynamic is occurring to the nth degree. And it will be occurring until I'm 110, provided that I maintain intention and will. Intention and will. The moment you lose intention, what has happened? Where are you? What island are you on if you're not on the island of intentional? You're on the island of default. Or you're hovering in between, and in this world, it will pull you to the island of default. Yes.
Can I ask, like you say you intended to go and sit out in your yard and enjoy the sun, and you were enjoying the feeling of the sun, so it's keeping your attention on the details of the sun and your environment, where you're sitting, sound around you,
Heck yeah.
that keep you in the present moment.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So that intention of sitting in the sun
Mm-hmm.
is a good intention if you intended it.
I would say it is a
That's
deliberate act. Yep.
A deliberate intention.
Yep.
To sit in the sun, enjoy the sun, enjoy the sun.
And
It's
maybe
when you said earlier on about you were sitting out in your yard and you're in a good place, you've done your gone practice and you're feeling really good. I was thinking, well, is that not a nice place to be? You know, it is a nice place to be, but still to keep your attention on the details of your environment around you.
Absolutely.
And not get lost in thought. Okay.
Bingo. So let's say that you intended to look at shadows today. And I'm being very intention compared to attention. Sure, I can do that. Might not have time for mind membrane, but I'll do that. So Ida, if you intended shadows at the beginning of the day, you find yourself outside, the sun is shining on your skin, and you choose to put your attention there. That is a deliberate act. Wouldn't you say that you have chosen? Now you're really emphasizing the flashlight of your attention isn't all willy-nilly. It's on the sun. It's on the feeling on your skin. That's more adaptable. That's more dynamic, but that isn't coasting. That isn't necessarily freestyling. It kind of is, but you're still intentional. There is deliberate intention and will, and you will accumulate personal power as long as that dynamic is in place. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's perfect. Thank you.
So real quick, and the discussion began because I will include this because the more a person practices this, the more they can't help but notice their actions, their words, their opinions are starting to differentiate from the world around them. Not thinking different thoughts, that's not what we're talking about. Behavior will change all of a sudden. So I don't want to use a lot of earnest examples, but I go to bed at 7:30. How common do you think that is among my peers?
Unless you're 8, no.
And do you think that's a problem for me at all? Absolutely not. Do you think that people judge me for it? Do you think that people get a little irritated when Ernest doesn't want to do anything socially because everything that people want to do starts at 8 a.m.? So I'm just pointing out that these things will occur. Do we need to declare war on them? No. Are they a problem? No. We just go back to our practice and just emphasize our intention and our will via attention. Make sense? And I could go on and on. I could give you a billion examples of how Ernest is not like my peer group.
You wrote in the chat when I was speaking earlier, and it doesn't accumulate personal power. And
Yes.
I just I don't know, I had a light bulb. I say the connection between everything being deliberate folly and the accumulation of personal power.
Deliberate, deliberate, deliberate. Yes.
And I think that's what Ida was just talking about, because, and Ida was saying it through the lens of choice. Every time you choose, I mean, that they all go together, right?
Yes.
Every choice that's deliberate is deliberate folly, and embodying that practice accumulates personal power. And then you become, the more you embody that practice, no matter where you are in the practice, whether you're new to it, embodiment means remembering as often as you can. Once remembering becomes a more fluid thing, and there's more, it's more porous between the seams, and the ride is smoother, is less bumpy. The remembering, forgetting, I mean. There is something gained as a result, an awareness that's gained, and that is personal power. It's the ability to, it's a tangible thing.
It is. It can
It's
be
a
felt to
tangible
the nth
thing,
degree.
and it uses the energy. I began this class talking about that I'm reading the Caroline, or rereading the Caroline Myss book. And she talks about the difference between curing and healing. And I think that that's where it is. Curing is a very thinking process. And it's about imposing something to counterbalance something else and considering it cured. Healing is about embodying a practice that accumulates personal power so that the body heals. It's a virtue of practicing.
Yeah. I personally wouldn't use the word heal, but I know exactly what she's talking about and I'm cool with it. I would use the word growing because of the association to the word heal in the world. The association to
right, or evolve, or whatever.
sometimes evolve is also
better.
Yeah. Sometimes people don't look at evolution. Evolution is actually quite benign. It's really not
forward movement.
It's
Right.
just, it's just we exist. I think that's pretty good. And if we're changing over time, then we are evolving, and that's pretty good. But
right.
Yeah.
No, it's not a hierarchy thing.
Yeah, people usually use evolution as I have leveled up, I have evolved, I am, so it's like, let's just tone that down a little bit. But yes, so let me show you to clarify intention and attention. And I saved this whiteboard just in case. So ideally, we want to create a type of symmetry. We want to align things. We want to connect things so that they can flow between them. And this should resonate to a certain extent because we've all been here. And I'll show how these are actually not the same things. So, Santina, would you say that you can have the desire, what's a desire? To go to the park, right? Let's say a bigger desire, travel the world. We want to travel and see every country and yada, yada. That's also another thing that's diametrically opposed to the world around me. I'm not a sightseer. I don't want to travel around and just look at the surface of shit. That doesn't excite me at all.
Sometimes it's to meet other cultures and get different perspectives.
But I want to spend time there, right? I want to connect to the culture. I want to enjoy. I don't want to just look at the surface of it and say, oh, that's shiny, and then go off to the next thing and go off to the next thing. And then, yeah. So that's a little bit different. But let's say we have the desire to travel. That was definitely a tangent. Sorry. Let's say that we have the desire to travel. We may have the desire to travel, but we haven't really intended it, right? It's kind of just sitting in the back of our mind. It's something we'd like to do someday. So they are related, desire and intention, but they're not the same thing because they can exist independently, right? You can have the other without the one, but not the one without the other. So it's not complete independence because intention does require desire. No matter what people say, even if you save someone else's life at the expense of your own, you had the desire to do that. Even if you're unaware of it, there was a desire there. So Santina, wouldn't you say that we could have the desire to do something? We could even intend to do it. So I am going to travel the world and I'm going to go ahead and book the flights. I'm going to make the plans. I got the money. Everything's all lined up, but then we don't actually do it. What happened? We didn't bring it into fruition. There wasn't the power of will. Now, there's no need to look at these words as these are concepts. We're looking at things conceptually and we're using words to define the concept. Does that make sense? So when I say willpower, that doesn't mean necessarily that there's this tangible energy running through my blood veins called will. Okay, there is, but that's a whole different discussion. It's more conceptual is what I'm trying to say. We don't need to get hung up in the verbiage, in the words that we're using, because the words only allude to concept. And very often concept cannot be translated with a single word. Look at chi. That is the biggest example. Anybody who says chi is life force energy, as I once said, that's just a very rudimentary, that's not the concept. We have not actually conveyed the concept at all. It's just a word. The English language and Americans, we like one-for-one associations. It's reductionism to the nth degree. Our society and culture was based on reductionism, and you'll see it in everything. Not the point. That's also a tangent. So, Santina, how do you think we align these three aspects of the triangle? What mechanism? What would we do? What would we use? How would we ever manage? Because we want to. Let's say we desire, we must want to, it's in our desire. So how do we take desire to intention and from intention to will? And how does will start to further feed more desire? How does this happen? Where does this occur? Do we just wish it? Do we just hope this shit works out for the best? Do we just go to a retreat and hope the residual energy will work itself out? Do we just sit in the backyard and like zened out and just hoping that the world will work out how we want it to work out because we're conscious creators, even though we're not conscious of anything necessarily? Not deliberate, it's attention. Deliberate attention. Where is the flashlight of your mind? Or do you even know? If you don't know, desire and intention can be miles apart. Have you ever heard of the word lazy? Have you ever heard of these words that people use to describe other people who, I don't use that word. Sometimes I'll say lazy awareness. It's a habit. We just get comfortable with something and I can actually explain that in the mind membrane. Where does laziness come from? I can explain that in the mind. It's not an affliction. It's not a negative word. That's not what I mean. So I probably won't use the word lazy because of the association to it, but yeah, we've all heard these words before. The reason is because the flashlight of their attention isn't focused. So they're just kind of hoping that new habits will cross the divide between desire and intention, but that doesn't necessarily imply the power of will. Have you ever met somebody who can work out every single day for 2 hours and their body just on the surface looks so good? That's amazing, right? But then we look potentially, and we're not trying to be judgmental, we're observing the nature of principle, but not every single aspect of their life is like that. Because it's not an embodiment, it's just another type of personal power is accumulated through intention and will, no matter who it is, no matter what they're doing. That's a principle. We do it deliberately, intentionally, and willfully, understanding the dynamic to accumulate more. And when I say accumulate more, that's a concept. I don't mean we're accumulating more. I mean the flow of it is becoming less encumbered. Does that make sense? So our goal that will happen on its own, it's a goalless goal because it will occur
So
as
we're allowing more of it because of what you just said. Our awareness, if our awareness of it is growing and we're allowing more of it, we're not accumulating it, it already
Sure.
exists.
Yeah, it will feel like accumulation though, which is why I use that word, because you can feel it more, it becomes more visceral. You might even be able to pinpoint personal power to a particular body location, lower dantian, maybe. And then so the reason I use that word accumulate is because that's how it feels.
Becomes more accessible.
It becomes all of that. But the feeling itself is like, I have more of this. That's not a true representation of the energy dynamics, but I do use that word to represent how it feels. I feel more confident. I feel more this and more that.
Like Luke Skywalker, feel the force, Luke.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it really makes sense. There is no try. You either do that shit or you don't do it. And you might learn because you didn't quite get to the goal, but it's just doing. Trying implies interference, thought, comparing, contrasting, labeling, judging, trying to figure it out. And
To me, trying is you want the goal without the technique.
There you go.
If there's no technique in place, there's no momentum. You can't allow it. Yeah, it implies interference.
Right. Show what on a slider? The attention part and how that all lines up makes sense, right? The triangle. In the driving force in here will be that's the driving force inside of this that makes this mechanism move and flow and connect and feed itself. The more that our will and our desire start to feed each other, the more we create this second triangle. And then before you know it, our intelligence, our fundamental intelligence, and I don't mean knowledge, I mean our connection to the fabric of the cosmos starts to align with desire. So slider, yeah. So this is the desire, the intention, and the power of will. And this could look more like a moving type of thing, because this circle is in motion. It's the driving force that keeps this circle going. Does that make sense? And this will lead to conscious creation. That's what this is. This is deliberate, conscious, intentional creation, aka law of attraction. The more you create space, the more you can access what is, I'm not going to use words like magnetism and that type of shit, but the more that we create space, the more that we can access the energy potential to realize our desires. The more we have just do energy without interference, any action that needs to be taken to get to the desire will get taken without it being a problem, without it being difficult necessarily. It could still be challenging. There could still be, it may not be easy necessarily. Like if you're climbing a mountain, that's not always going to be easy, but you can do it without the mind interference and it will be easier. Does that make sense? And they can even make it look easy, but if they tell you, was this easy? They'll be like, actually, it's not. It's simple, but it won't always feel easy. especially muscular, you know, you're trying to climb a mountain. Does that all make sense? And so I look at my life experience. I have created the space. I'm accessing infinite possibility. Things are coming to me just as much as I'm going to them, but I'm paying attention. If you don't pay attention to the world around you, how are you going to see, you know, you hear that phrase, opportunity knocks. Well, if you're in the other fucking room and you're not listening and you're not paying attention, you're not going to hear it knock. They can ring the doorbell, bang on the door, but you're too busy, you know, lost in habitual cyclical patterns of behavior and cognition. Well, cognition and behavior, and then behavior and cognition, because they start to feed each other. All this makes sense? One of the things that people do in this world is they mistake the body's ability to adapt to the human natural potential, like where the human being has evolved from. Circadian rhythm is a great example. Have you ever heard someone say, I'm a night person? That's not a human thing necessarily. That's their body has adapted. And now their body has changed and adapted around being a night person. But there is plenty of evidence to conclude that there is actually a human circadian rhythm. For example, cultures that are separated by space and time all found that 5 a.m. is the best time. Early in the morning, the crack of dawn is the best time to pray, the best time to meditate, the best time to clear your mind and access the infinite. So that is common in traditions that are native to the United States, what is now the United States, ancient China. You can find this in Greek mythology. You can find this in
Well,
Arab
it's more
cultures.
like dawn. It's more like dawn.
It's
'Cause
more like
time is
dawn.
relative.
Yeah, time is
'Cause
relative.
time is relative, yeah.
Yeah. But we're looking at about 5 a.m. That's about the time that the sun will rise ish. The only reason I would use 5 a.m. is if somebody's hoping to use this as a technique and they're like, well, you know, I want to wake up a little earlier. Why the hell would I do that? Well, the reason is because your brain is in a constant, well, the entire body, all of our cells are in a constant transfer of energy. And at the end of the day, as you're going throughout your day, your brain is transferring energy to energy potential that when you sleep, it will transfer the energy. I'm talking about ATP, the cycle of ATP. Your brain will recharge. It will take what it has used, and also in addition to your nutrition and the new things that you're putting in your body to build new ATP. But basically, you use your mind energy throughout the day. And if you're thinking dumb shit, if you're going through emotional turmoil, you're using much more of it. But then when you sleep, assuming that you sleep well, your brain recharges. And when you wake up, you have fresh ATP, which means that the mind is now ready to do its thing. And human beings have evolved in a certain way. You know, we're not nocturnal animals. So there is individuality, but they weren't born with that necessarily. Human beings are born in the same circadian rhythm. However, because we're wildly adaptable creatures, for whatever reason, a person decided to stay up till 3 a.m. for 10 years, they have altered their own personal circadian rhythm and their body has adapted, and now they are a night person. They weren't born that way, very likely. Does that make sense? That's kind of talking about adaptation and how we can adapt and evolve on an individual level. But as a species, there is always what's best for the species, and you can't get around it. The best you can do is that the mind, you could look at it in, for lack of a better term, right now, actually I have better terms, but they might be a little convoluted, but mind over matter. However,
There were two really good examples in the news. One was those children that survived in the jungle.
mhm.
And the other was this woman who won some kind of competition that only men have won in the past, some survival thing. They drop you in Alaska like in the tundra, and then you have to survive. And she, I just saw a small interview with her, and a lot of the principles that you're talking about right now were at play, and some that I didn't realize about the body's adaptation, of having no food and for a period of time, and why that was beneficial to her body. And it actually, she said she no longer has some physical issues that she's lived with most of her life because of the 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 conditions that she was under. Her body corrected itself, it rebooted in a way. It's just very interesting. It was both those examples, both of those instances to me were examples of principle that you're talking about right now for adaptation and mind over matter.
Exactly. Yeah. The tricky thing about mind over matter, though, is like that is true, but how do you plan to do that with interference? How do you plan to do that without focus? How do you plan to do that without the impeccability of so if you really want to access mind over matter, do the Qigong practice all the way up and through hydrostasy, and then you'll start to see mind over matter. And then, but you'll also start to see the same dynamics that we're all working with. And as human beings, like your body needs ATP, you need the electron transport train in mitochondria, you need these things, and there is no getting around it. I don't care who you are. You may have adapted to where you just don't feel like shit right now because of the adaptation principle, but to a certain extent, we are all far more similar than we are different. We all have greater tuberosities of the humerus. We all have these things. I mean, these are characteristics of the human experience through evolution, and we're all subject to them. And so in principle, the person will start to, and when I say healthier, that's relative to the individual and the context, and there's no judgment there, but a person will likely start to follow, oh, hey, when I eat a certain way, when I have a limitation of activity, when I do these certain things, I feel a certain way because I'm in hydrostasy and I'm so in tune with how everything feels. And then, of course, the behavior will start to align with the desire, the intention, and the will to feel a certain way. And then before you know it, you're eating a certain way, drinking a certain way, sleeping a certain way. You have a certain amount of activity, a certain amount of exercise, and that is not in comparison or contrast to any other human being alive, which is one reason traditional Chinese medicine is so amazing, in my opinion, because they've already covered those bases. Nutrition in traditional Chinese medicine is for you. It's not just, it's not for you to compare with Ernest or compare to master, yada, yada, such and such. And it's relative to where you live. It's relative to how you woke up today and how you feel today. It's relative to the seasons. There's even a cosmological aspect if you choose to look at it that way. But it's always, where are you right now? We're not looking at things as you must not, cannot, should not, will not. It's all about balance, the principle of balance. Whereas eating meat all the time would be equally imbalanced as raw vegan in that context. And I can see that. So is there anything wrong with raw vegan? For me, yes, because it would violate the principle of balance. Is eating only meat good for me? Absolutely not, because it would violate the principle of balance. I also know that my body needs these other nutrients and things. And when you learn about cellular biology, when you learn about how the human being works, none of the shit's a mystery. It's all like, oh, so we've known this for this long and we're still fumbling about in the dark like a species that has no idea. That's
And
weird.
all of that, the more that we discover, the more we reinforce those things. We don't discover something new. We just discover new ways to see what is the principles at play. I mean,
There
it's
you go.
happening, everything is happening on a cellular level and exactly exactly the same principles. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. Is any of that? I would like to do the mind membrane sometime so people, you can see
I
what.
actually wrote it down on a piece of paper for next
Okay,
class.
that's a good
There's
one.
nothing, mind membrane, and I think what sparked I'd like to talk about that was, what did I write here? Oh, you were having a discussion with the owner of the acupuncture place, and you were saying, I'm sure you don't wake up thinking about me, so why should I wake up
Mhm.
thinking about the clavicular joint? And you know the reason why you're thinking about it, and you can explain it in terms of the mind membrane. So that,
Exactly.
I wrote it down so that I could remind you as a topic if we're topicless
Okay,
next time.
yeah, and it is where thoughts come from. Because
Right,
a lot of people, if you ask a room of 75 people where thoughts come from, you'll get 75 different answers. So I can sum this up in pictures and stuff.
great.
Yeah. All right. Any questions, comments, or concerns before we head out? Went a little bit over time, but not too bad. Okay, so I think the Igong book 1 will be ready for print and publish and all that jazz today or tomorrow. And then Igong book 2 should be done. What is it? I would think it's done by the end of the month. I just need to look at it again and stare at it and see if there's anything else I want to add. And I do envision revisions. I do envision a compendium that has all of the 5 books put together. And then I envision spin-offs. How does Igong apply to traditional Chinese medicine? How does Igong apply to nutrition, how we eat? How does Igong apply to careers and businesses and all of these things? I want to write little spin-off things that the other one I kind of want to write before I finish all 5 is the need for Igong. Why the fuck would we do this all in the first place? Like, what is going on in the human experience that's just so fucking insane? It's insane the way that human beings in general are interacting with their own cognition. It is utter insanity, and those are the reasons for Igong. These books, I will send the PDF copy in our group, but that's just for our group. And then on my website will be a link that says books, and that will take you to Lulu where you can purchase the book. The profit is set at a very small amount just to help cover the costs of everything. And I don't own a printing press, so I can't do books for free. And I was told that if I'm a little too giving of the PDF, that could lead to plagiarism and copyright things. So I have to be a little bit careful with that. When they purchase something, then now you have a proof of purchase and everything else. And yeah, so. All right. Well, otherwise, I will see everybody again on Wednesday. It sounds like we have fun stuff to talk about if you could make it. And I'll post this to YouTube as soon as I can. All right. See you, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. If you have questions, comments, or concerns, you can send them to me in private or whatever. It's all good. All right. See you, everyone. Bye. Let me save this whiteboard just in case. Is this a good whiteboard? Yeah, let's save it. Not a bad whiteboard. Okay. All right. I'll see everyone Wednesday.